You whack your hand up and Vess is there ready to hand out those kids packs. Wonderful. Well, are you ready for the word this morning? We're going to, next 3 weeks, we've got 3 weeks between now and our Christmas, including our Christmas Eve service. And we're just going to do some Christmas messages, the Christmas series 22. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this message with you this morning. And we're going to go to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. And we're going to read from verse 1 through to verse 17. Are you excited? Are you ready for this? Are you sure? Hold on tight. The genealogy of Jesus. Everyone's looking at me like, is he for real? Yes, I am. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Ready? Big breath. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Are you enjoying this? You feeling inspired? Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asa. Who's getting some good ideas for some biblical names for some children? And Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, there's a good name. And Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram. And Jehoram the father of Uzziah. Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz. Ahaz the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah the father of Manasseh. Manasseh the father of Amon. Amon the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, or Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to Christ. God bless his word. Have a nice day. Enjoy the rest of your time. Inspiring stuff. Hey, in the King James Version, we used to call it the begats. Someone begat someone, begat someone. Who's heard of them called the begats? And what this is actually the preamble to the news that was about to be made. What was the news? In verse 18 it says, this is how the birth of Jesus come about. This statement relates to the news that the angel delivered. In verse 21 it says, she will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, and he will save his people from their sins. In verse 23 it says, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him what? Emmanuel. What does that mean? God with us. Now some would say, well, all that news that you've just read is a fairy story. It's a fairy tale. It's nothing but a fairy story. In fact, I remember once we put out invitations in this local area here. We had a day over in the park over there called Ton of Fun. Does anybody remember that? And we letterbox dropped the whole area inviting people to our Ton of Fun. And it obviously stood on the nerves of somebody in particular, and they wrote me a very nasty email that said, please do not put any of your rubbish in my letterbox. I do not want to talk about or hear about your imaginary friend. Thank you very much. Because in some people's minds, they'd say it's a fairy story. It's just a fairy tale. Well, let me tell you this. Fairy tales begin with what sentence? Once upon a time. But the birth of Jesus doesn't begin with once upon a time, because it's not a fairy story. It's not a myth. It's grounded in history. And the story of Jesus starts with a historical record. It starts with the genealogy, and this is extremely significant, and I want to show you why this morning. You with me? We'll come back to the fairy story thing in a few moments. But firstly, this genealogy pre-announces the grace of God. It pre-announces the grace of God. Your genealogy in Jewish culture, your genealogy was very important. And it wasn't just your genealogy, it was your resume. It's the way in which you presented yourself to the world. It's the way in which you announced yourself to the world or recommended yourself to the world. It was your heritage, it was your clan, it was your lineage, and it was most important. In fact, it was so important that some people would mess with their genealogy. They'd change it. A little bit like we mess with our resumes. How many of you know if you've had a few fails, we might leave that off our resume? We'll leave that out. We want to, and so it was a bit like with your genealogy. Some people would like to delete certain people from your family tree. We don't talk about that uncle. We don't talk about that particular person. Or at least we spend all our time proving that the best traits in our family come from, the worst traits in our family come from the other side of the family tree. Is that right? Because that's true. We all know that. In fact, someone once said, if you don't know who the black sheep is in your family, it's probably you. Another story. And people actually did that. They would mess with their genealogy. In fact, Herod the Great, who was alive at the time of the birth of Jesus, removed numbers of people from his genealogy. But when we read the genealogy of Jesus, which we just skip through and they're just a blur of names and you go, what on earth is that all about? But when you read through and if you pick through the genealogy of Jesus, Jesus does the exact opposite to what people would do in a normal genealogy. And there's some amazing people that are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Firstly, let me highlight a few. Firstly, there's 5 women. And you go, well, so what? Well, in ancient times, women weren't there. They didn't count. That's just the way it was. They weren't important. They were gender outsiders. But Jesus has women in his genealogy. But not only does he have women, but he has Gentile women. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. They were Canaanites, people who were despised. They were Moabites, people who were feared and despised. They were absolute outsiders. They were people who under no circumstances would be allowed into the temple. You could come into the Gentiles' court, but you would not be accepted into the presence of God. You would not be accepted into the Holy of Holies or into the inner court, because you were considered unclean. So not only were they gender outsiders, they were racial outsiders. But Jesus has them in his genealogy. But it gets worse. Not only are there gender outsiders and racial outsiders, there are moral outsiders. In fact, Matthew goes out of his way to talk about the underbelly, the sordid, immoral, nasty, sinful incidents in the Bible, out of which come Jesus himself. They're directly in his lineage. In verse 3, you read Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was who? Tamar. So Perez actually come about through an incestuous act where Tamar fooled her father-in-law into sleeping with him. And as a result, it's an absolute thing that would have caused them to be stoned in Jewish. It was a shameful thing. It was considered an incestual act. And it's mentioned. In Jesus' genealogy, Matthew puts it in. And he also includes Zerah, the brother, who's also not a part of Jesus' lineage. Why? Because he wants to make sure that they knew the whole story. Oh yeah, no, this is not confusing with someone else. That's that person. Then he mentions a woman by the name of Rahab. Rahab was Boaz's mum. Rahab was a Canaanite, so she was a gender outsider because she was a woman. She was a racial outsider because she was a Canaanite, but she was also a prostitute. This is all in the genealogy of Jesus. She was a prostitute in the city of Jericho. And then in verse 6, it mentions David. David. Jesse, the father of King David. Now you're talking. That's who I want in my genealogy, of course. I want a king. I want people that will give me standing. I want them on my resume. But then Matthew goes out of his way and he says, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been, what? Uriah's wife. Who was Solomon's mum? Bathsheba. Remember, you know the story, but it doesn't say who's the son of Bathsheba. It actually goes out of his way to point out that Solomon's mother had been Uriah's wife. What's that saying? Uriah was one of David's best friends. You know, if you read back if you know a little bit about the story of David, David was under threat by King Saul. Saul was chasing him, was after him for his life, and David flees. And there's a couple of guys who put their life on the line and went out with David. They were called David's mighty men. And they went out and they protected David through that very dangerous time in David's life. And Uriah was one of those mighty men. He was one of David's most loyal subjects. And so Uriah's out fighting at war and David's not, and he's up on the roof having a bit of a walk around and he sees Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, taking a bath, and it says that, well, I love the way the old song puts it, David was smitten down to his socks when he first set eyes on that Bathsheba fox. But he sees Bathsheba taking a bath and he calls her to himself. He sleeps with her. She falls pregnant. And then in a bid to try and cover it, he calls Uriah back from war to sleep with his wife. Bible's interesting, isn't it? Man, you need to read it. Calls him back to sleep with his wife, and Uriah's such a loyal servant, he wouldn't go and spend the night with his wife. So in desperation, David sends him back into battle and gets him killed in battle. And so when Matthew is writing the genealogy, he doesn't say Solomon, and Bathsheba was pregnant and she had a son called Solomon. And so when Matthew's writing that, he doesn't say Solomon was the son of Bathsheba. It says, no, Solomon was the son of Uriah's wife. Matthew throws David under the genealogical bus big time. Wow. What's all this about? You see, we have moral outsiders, we have adulterers, incest, a prostitute, we have gender outsiders, racial outsiders, cultural outsiders, moral outsiders, and they're all in Jesus' genealogy. And the law of Moses would have excluded them from the Holy of Holies, from the presence of God. But here we have Jesus owning them and identifying with them. People excluded by culture, excluded by the law. They were outsiders, but Jesus was bringing them in. That's why the stable is so significant. He was outside. He wasn't in. But Jesus' birth in the stable signified that he was bringing the outsiders in. And even his genealogy shows us that Jesus was owning, he was bringing the outsiders in. Listen to me this morning, it doesn't matter what your pedigree, it doesn't matter what law, how low you have fallen, what law you have of God's laws you've broken, because, listen to me this morning, even if you've betrayed a friend to death, the grace of God is there for you this morning. We are all outside. Listen, Jesus can save you this morning. He can save you. Jesus was bringing them all in. The grace of God is for you. Jesus can save you. We're all outsiders. We all stand in the need of the grace of God. That in Christ there is no male nor female, there is no Jew nor Gentile, there is no moral or immoral. Listen, if you believe and accept the news of Jesus Christ, prostitutes and kings can sit together at the table of God. The genealogy of Jesus declares the grace of God, pre-announces the grace of God. What a privilege that we have to be Christians this morning. That God owns us. He's not ashamed of us this morning. And there it is in the genealogy. Matthew goes out of his way doesn't airbrush it, doesn't put a filter over it, like our Facebook posts. But he gives you the hard facts. The genealogy of Jesus declares the grace of God. Let's come back to the idea of the fairy story. You see, the genealogy of Jesus, what it does is it makes Jesus a historical figure. A historical figure. It doesn't start, the story of Jesus doesn't start with once upon a time, because that would be a fairy tale, right? Now, fairy tales and fairy stories have incredible appeal. They've got common themes, and they tend to repeat over and over. They might have different characters. But they tend to repeat themselves, and they have common themes. They often have royalty involved. They have good versus evil. They have something magical that takes place. They have somebody saved from a desperate situation, and they all live happily ever after, right? You know, think about some of the great fairy stories, and when they're told well, they move you. You know, Peter Pan and Beauty and the Beast and Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, Snow White, and if you go to like modern day stories of, you know, Lord of the Rings, etc. Well, that's not that modern anymore, but anyway, you get the picture. The fact is, they didn't happen. They're not truth, but they kind of fill a longing in the human heart for something that we wished was true. And it fills a longing in our heart that real life can't satisfy. It's a fantasy. We escape death. Something supernatural takes place. We live forever. We have a love that is unconditional. It goes beyond ugliness. There's a handsome prince or a beautiful princess. We fly. One day we'll triumph over evil. There's and as I said, is that when they're well told, they're moving stories, and inside there's something that goes, if only that was true. And so then we come to Christmas, and we have, someone from outer space comes and breaks into our lives. That person grows up and has miraculous powers, and can calm storms and heal the sick, and even cause dead people to come back to life. And then his enemies turn on him and they put him to death, and all hope is gone. But no, he then rises from the dead and he saves everybody, and they all live happily ever after, to those who believe. And people go, see what I mean? Just another fairy story. All as Christmas is, it's just that need inside of us to have some kind of fantasy that this is gonna happen, and it points us to what we wish was true. But Matthew, the genealogies say no. It doesn't begin with once upon a time. It starts with the genealogy of Jesus. It's not another story pointing to realities, listen, that we wish was true, but Jesus is the reality to which all these stories point. Who believes that this morning? Does anybody else believe that this morning? He's real. It happened. Christmas is real. And Jesus comes from an ideal world. There is an evil sorcerer, if you like, and we are under his spell. And the prince has broken that spell, and he offers a way out of bondage and trap. There is a love that is unconditional. He will defeat death. We will fly, and we will live forever. Does anyone here believe that this morning? Because Matthew doesn't begin with once upon a time. He begins with the genealogy of Jesus, which sets it as a historical event. It pre-announces the grace of God. It makes Jesus not a fairy story, but a figure of history. And then lastly, it means that Jesus is our ultimate rest. You said some significant things this morning, Al, about sleep. Sleep is ultimately rest, isn't it? Let me explain. In Genesis, it says God created the world in how many days? 6 days. And what happened on the seventh? He rested. Now, I'm not big into Bible numerics. I think Bible numerics we can make things that are just never meant to be there. But 7 is a very significant number in the Bible. It's the number of completeness. It's the number of rest. In the book of Revelation, it talks about the 7 churches, and the 7 angels, and the 7 saints, and the 7 trumpets, and the 7 stars, and I could go on. And some numerics, I think, are a bridge too far, but not this. This is incredible. In fact, Matthew goes out of his way to identify it. So that's what this verse 17 is all about. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile of Babylon, and 14 from the exile to Christ. So what's this all about? Well, I'll tell you what it means. I'll say it and then I'll explain it. It means that Jesus is the 7th 7. He's the 7th 7. So how many 14s are there here? 3 14s. So the first 14, that's 7 number 1 and number 2. Who can see that? The second 14, that's 7 number 3 and number 4. The third 14 is 7th number 5 and number 6. And then Jesus is the 7th 7. Does that make sense? Do you want to look at that for a minute? Let me say it one more time. There's 3 14s, and it's not 14, 28, 42. No. This 7 goes into 14. We all know that. The first 14, there's 2 7s. That's 1 and 2. Second 14, there's 2 7s. That's 3 and 4. The third 14th, there's 2 7s. That's number 5 and number 6. Jesus is the 7th 7. Listen, and in him we are complete. In him we are complete. In him we find ultimate rest. God rested on the 7th day. The Sabbath day was a day of rest. Listen, every 7th year, the land in Jewish culture, the land had to have a rest. In the 7th year, you couldn't plant, nor could you reap. It enabled the land to replenish itself. It rested. In Leviticus chapter 25, every 7th 7, in other words, every Sabbath. In other words, in every 49 years, it was declared the year of Jubilee, which meant on the year of Jubilee, all slaves would be freed and all debts would be released. You get that? They could rest from their weariness. They could rest from their burden. And you see, Jesus was the 7th 7th. He was the one that when you believe in him, he gives you rest. And so Jesus was not born once upon a time. Matthew wants us to get this. He really broke into time and space. He loves you and I unconditionally. He's defeated death and he's accomplished, listen, on our behalf. He has accomplished on our behalf our salvation, Prostitute and king can sit together at his table and he's not ashamed of you. He's equally proud of all of us. He loves us. We only have to believe. It's because of the grace of God this morning that we can sit at the table of the King and we can have come into a place of rest when you believe in Jesus himself. He is our rest. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who labor. Come to me, all you who are just trying that little bit harder to be right with God. Come to me, you who are weary and weighed down with a burden. All you who labor, and I will give what? You rest. Wow. You see, Jesus is my Sabbath. Jesus is my Jubilee. He is the one that has set the slave free. He is the one that set me free. He is the one that has paid my debt. The debt has been forgiven this morning. And it brings inside an incredible rest. Jesus is our rest. I want to do better to please him and because I love him. But I don't have to do better to know him and for him to love me. He gives me rest. Can I say that again? I want to do better to please him because I love him. But I don't have to do better to know him and for him to love me. He gives me rest. Wow. What a wonderful Savior we have. We can rest from anxiety. We can rest from stress. We can rest from the troubles of this world. I'll tell you why. Another reason why we can rest is because one day some of us stress and worry so much over the troubles of this world and what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, let me tell you, one day everything will be put right. Someday we're going to meet the true love. He's going to give us beauty for ashes. He'll turn our beastliness into beauty. He will be our true knight who will slay all the dragons and put everything right. Who believes that this morning? And that's why Habakkuk says in 2:14, it says, the whole earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. He is our rest, my brother and my sister, this morning. Wow, what a significant thing Christmas is. That's why Christmas, and I said this last weekend at our production, that's why Christmas, the story of Jesus, the gospel, the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus is not advice. It's not something that we need to do. It's news. It's good news. It's about what's been done. It's about something that has happened. It's already been accomplished. And it's not a fairy story. And whatever your background is, if you believe in Jesus, you are welcome at his table. It's been done. It's been done. And you can come to him this morning, cease from your labors, and come and find rest with Jesus. Who believes that this morning? He's not ashamed of you. That's why in Hebrews 2 he says he's not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. To the one this morning who's never sure if he's right with God, to the one who's never sure that they've done enough, the genealogy says this morning, he's your rest. To the one who feels ongoing condemnation, and every time you come to church and you try and worship and you feel condemned, let me tell you this morning, he's the one that gives you rest. You can worship him this morning. Worship is not about you, it's about him. That's why we worship. To the one who thinks, would God accept me? Have I fallen too far? Have I overstepped too many boundaries? Well, the genealogy says, you're in. The stable says, you're in. The genealogy declares, you're in. You see, the gospel this morning is good news. I love the words in the song, the end is written, it is finished. The end is written, it is finished this morning. It's done. Jesus is our rest. Are you living in a place of rest today? And I think we'd be doing what? No wonder it said peace on earth. You can never have peace without rest. You're never going to have peace without rest. If the gospel was about, hey, if you try harder, if you live up to a certain standard, that is not good news. That's a burden you will carry every day of your life. But when you come to the place where you say, Jesus, Christmas is not advice to how I should live and what I must do, but Christmas is news announcing what has been done. And today, Jesus, I put my faith and trust in you. If I could be good enough to go to heaven, listen, that's called salvation by works. And on my best day, my Bible tells me that my righteousness is like filthy rags. In fact, that means menstrual cloths. Sorry, but that's true. So this morning, understand. I've known a lot of people who have been Christians all their life, but have never really entered into rest. And I think for people who know Jesus, you've accepted Jesus, you love Jesus. You know, I don't want to confuse you this, but don't bring in too many terms. But we talk about, justification and sanctification. Justification is something where we're being made right with God by what Jesus did, and then sanctification is us becoming more and more like Christ. But we start to depend upon our sanctification for our justification. You've been made right with God. You can live from a place of rest this morning. And because you have Christ in you, your life changes. Who hears me this morning? But you do that from a place of rest. It's done. So the genealogies tell us a lot. What a great thing Christmas is. The birth of Jesus. And the question this morning is, it's good news of what's been done. It's ground in history. It's not a fairy story. Question is, it's the only question, do you believe? Do you believe? Have you put your trust in Jesus? Have you received the gift of God's dear Son? Have you received the gift of Christmas? God in the flesh.